You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Yes, we are talking about tariffs again. Many of the world's countries are awaiting the impact of new American tariffs, which are slated to take effect on Thursday. One country, however, is experiencing that effect now. The Trump administration bumped up tariffs on Canadian goods to 35%, and that new rate went into effect on Friday. Trump said he made the change in part because of Canada's failure to curb the flow of fentanyl and other illicit drugs into the U.S. Now, 35% sounds intense, but a lot of Canadian goods are actually exempt from that increase because of a trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. So it's kind of confusing to know exactly what these tariffs mean for our neighbor to the north or the relationship between British Columbia and Washington state. Here to help us understand is Thomas Davidoff, an associate professor at the University of British Columbia's Sauder School of Business. Professor, thanks very much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So Trump already put tariffs on Canada in the months leading up to this recent change. In fact, we've had a number of different effects, including on the steel industry, on the auto industry. I mean, what changed last week?
Right. So as you mentioned, automotive, steel, aluminum, I think are quite important, mostly in Ontario, more so than in British Columbia, where theirs aren't big. I think something's happening with softwood lumber, but that's always confusing. Mostly, I think over 90% of what crosses the border is exempt, and it might even be more than that can be exempt. It just a lot of stuff people haven't bothered documenting since NAFTA years and years ago, and CUSMA or USMCA, as it was redubbed when Trump had some renegotiations the last time around. Most things are not tariffed, so that there wasn't any point documenting that you were subject to that agreement. Now you need to document that you're subject to the agreement, or else you get hit with this horrible 35% rule. Exactly what is in the stuff that's non-compliant, other than having failed to document, I'm not entirely sure. But I can be sure that people are going to be scrambling to make sure they are exempt if possible.
What's the biggest impact to British Columbia, as far as you've seen, when it comes to this new trade relationship between the U.S. and Canada?
Well, the Canadian economy is palpably weaker than it was a year or two ago. Now, a lot of that is high interest rates, and probably the biggest factor in British Columbia has been reduced immigration into Canada. Justin Trudeau, our former prime minister, had really escalated immigration, and that put a lot of pressure on the housing market. Then between higher interest rates and pulling the plug on immigration, we've just had a much weaker economy. And I think that's most of what's been going on. The tariff confusion certainly doesn't help. And if I were sitting in Ontario, I think it would be a very different story because, again, automotive, steel, aluminum are a big deal there. So they're really suffering. I think, if anything, we're a very real estate reliant market. A recession in Ontario could even lead to lower interest rates, which could probably be a net benefit in British Columbia. So I don't think lost trade to the U.S. has been nearly as big here as there. That having been said, so much of Canadian exports go to the U.S. That there's no doubt we'll feel something.
So do you think that this decision to have the new 35% rate take effect on Friday was more symbolic than really impactful for Canada? I mean, we mentioned most of the goods, if you do the paperwork, if exporters are going to do the paperwork, do fall under the USMCA, the Mexico-Canada trade agreement that now, is covering those from having the 35%. So was this more of a symbolic move, or do you see any effects of this new tariff rate?
I think there will be some impacts, right? I mean, so much of what Canada does is export to the U.S. Anybody paying 35%, that becomes prohibitive. Further loss of employment and productivity is not good, especially given what I mentioned with immigration and interest rates in Canada today. We're at a vulnerable point. But certainly the fact that he didn't scrap CUSMA is a very big deal.
The U.S.'s other biggest trading partner, Mexico, got a 90-day reprieve, another 90-day reprieve on new tariff rates that the Trump administration announced last week, but not Canada. I mean, the 35% took effect immediately on Friday on Canada. What's the read on why the U.S. wanted to immediately slap new rates on Canada, but give other countries a little break?
It's fun to speculate. Obviously, Canada is, I think, the second largest trading partner for the U.S. after Mexico. It's by far, Canada is, no, the U.S. is by far Canada's number one trading partner. So we're very reliant. Canada did push back a little bit. We had counter tariffs, whereas most countries, very much to my chagrin, have sort of rolled over. Now, I'm a U.S. citizen, so I say this with some reluctance. But what has been remarkable is the failure around the world, particularly in the EU, to push back and impose counter tariffs so that Trump is reluctant. What we've seen is country after country weekly try to negotiate a one-off deal rather than say something along the lines, if you have a tariff on any other country, we're going to put 100% tariff, say, on U.S. goods and services. That might have had some impact. Canada is one of a few countries, along with China, that pushed back. And Trump may rationally be saying, look, I'm going to make an example of any country that puts up countermeasures.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is kind of an interesting figure in this. And I know you're, not a politics researcher or anything, but
certainly a consumer.
Yeah, certainly. And this is, so Mark Carney, former central banker, he's with the Liberal Party. From the outside, American perspective looking in, he seemed to be the surprise winner in 2025 because he was talking tough about Trump. He was the guy that was going to fight Trump the most. And that shifted Canadian voters away from the more conservative candidate. And that combative tone has somewhat softened. I mean, you mentioned there has been retaliatory tariffs on Canada's part, but Carney has also put out some olive branches, like rescinding the digital services tax. I don't know. What do you make of how Carney is navigating this and what kind of pressures he's facing to fix the trade situation with the U.S.?
Yeah, so let's take a step back. First of all, to the election, you're right. The 2025 election was shocking from the perspective of late 2024, when the conservatives under Pierre Poilievre seemed to have about a 99% chance of winning. They were leading by so much in the polls. And what happened? Number one, Trudeau left. He was quite unpopular after a long time in power since 2015. And number two, I think the political right was discredited by the election of Donald Trump. I mean, that was really, Poilievre sounded more like Trump than Carney did, and I think that was a big problem. But yes, Carney had his sort of elbows up fight against the tariff sort of perspective. And since he's been in office, I do think he's tried to accommodate more than he has, at least visibly, been fighting, sort of attacking back with further tariffs. As you mentioned, repealing the digital services tax was a pretty big accommodation. So why is that happening? Again, I think the answer is probably a perception and a reality that the U.S. is such a huge part of the Canadian economy that something like scrapping NAFTA, CUSMA would have been a disaster for our economy. And I think Carney is trying to, while preserving some dignity for Canada, make a deal with the U.S. And, so far, not too bad. The 35% seems bad, but again, 90% of exports not being tariffed is pretty good.
You talked about preserving dignity for Canada. How big of a factor is the talk from Trump about the 51st state and annexing it and sort of the big footing of Canada that's come from the White House in this whole situation? I mean, we've heard already that there has been a big drop in tourism, especially Canadians to the U.S. Have you noticed a change in the attitude of Canadians towards Americans at this point, and particularly, BC to Washington State, which is, what we're mostly worried about, having such close relationship here? Well, have you noticed a big change in the mood or the ways that Canadians feel about the U.S.?
Well, we've had American visitors here, and we're U.S. citizens ourselves, and I don't think there's any hostility towards Americans. I think Canadians' depth of understanding of U.S. politics greatly exceeds Americans' understanding of Canadian politics. So people recognize that Washington is a blue state, for example, and Seattle a blue city within a blue state. So I don't think there's a lot of hostility in that direction. I do think there's been an effort to buy Canadian, probably weaker today than a couple of months ago because attention lags and people probably focus on price more than politics when they're shopping. What interests me is what the real cause of the decline in travel to the U.S. is. I think some of it is a political reaction to the tariffs. I suspect, however, a lot of it is also a much weaker exchange rate than we've seen historically, plus a weak Canadian economy would lead to fewer trips to the U.S. as well.
Now, people are looking at their pocketbooks maybe more so than, searching their hearts about how they feel about the U.S. is what you're saying, possibly. In the long run, what are you going to be watching for as this whole trade reorganization by the Trump administration plays out, particularly when it comes to its effects on Canada and British Columbia?
Well, what's going to happen under Trump is a matter of tremendous uncertainty, as I'm sure many of your listeners have thought about. The future of democracy in the U.S. altogether is up in the air. The future of U.S. as some kind of enforcer of political and civil rights around the world is open to question. The U.S. as an educational hub is open to question. So there's lots and lots that's tremendously uncertain. With trade, the volatility is bad for the Canadian economy. It's bad for economies around the world. So far, the U.S. economy has been quite resilient. The stock market's been doing well. Last week was not a great week for anybody. We saw bad jobs numbers leading to the firing of a chief economist, which does not inspire confidence. So there is certainly a world in which these tariffs lead to a lot of weakness. One model that I think is useful is to think of Trump sort of having a put option on the economy. That is to say, when things are good, he has some liberty, and we start to see him impose higher tariffs, make outrageous statements. He dials the tariffs back. It seems like when the markets, the bond market, the stock market perform poorly. So is there a world in which there's just a cataclysm in the U.S. economy because of the tariffs? People are miserable because of inflation and the stock market suffers. It's hard to believe the tariffs wouldn't get pulled back in that world. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine a lot that's happened in U.S. policy. So I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty over the path of tariffs between the U.S. and Canada and between the U.S. and the rest of the world.
I was struck by something that the governor of the Bank of Canada said last week when talking about the state of the Canadian economy and referencing tariffs. Quote, Canada needs to think about its place in the global trading economy. We are very concentrated in our trade with the U.S. The message is the world is changing. Is it viable for Canada to look elsewhere to replace the U.S. as a trading partner, or maybe just supplement the kind of exchange of goods that happens between Canada and the U.S. with outside partners? And where would that possibly be?
Yeah, the Globe and Mail today has a story about all the trips that have been made by one of our ministers, globally trying to cut trade deals to eliminate tariffs on both sides, Brazil being an obvious example. But, two of my colleagues, Keith Head and John Reese, have been pioneers in gravity models of trade, which is to say, where are the people and who's close to you? And that tends to be where trade goes. So the U.S. is obviously a tremendous gravitational pull for Canada. It is not easy to replace the low transportation costs, the low cultural costs, the relationships that already exist, the low friction because of them. That's not easy to replace, and it will be costly and bad for Canada if that relationship weakens. That said, China is an enormous economy. India, Brazil. You look at the EU. It's natural to think that some of the exports that would have gone to the U.S. will go elsewhere, maybe at greater transportation costs, maybe at greater contracting costs. But it's hard to believe there won't be a reaction both for steel, aluminum, and cars, and any of that other 10% not covered by KUOW business that had been going to the U.S.
Thomas Davidoff is an associate professor in the University of British Columbia's Sauder School of Business. Really appreciate your time today, Professor, and it's great talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.